All right, so you know those massive container ships you see, the ones stacked sky high with all those colorful containers just chugging across the ocean.
Yeah.
Ever wonder, like, how does anyone even begin to figure out who pays for what when it comes to moving all that stuff around the globe?
Oh, yeah.
Maybe you are that someone, part of a company trying to figure out how to get your product to a whole new market, overseas.
Mhm.
Either way, you sent us some really interesting stuff about international shipping contracts, and we're gonna totally dive in and try to make sense of it all.
That's good.
You know, cut through the jargon, get down to the nitty-gritty of how the costs and responsibilities get divided up.
Right.
So by the end of this, you'll walk away feeling like, okay, I actually get this now.
Clarity. Yeah.
Exactly.
Clarity. Yeah. One of the first things that really jumps out from these materials is the sheer necessity of these agreements.
Oh,
We're talking about goods that are traveling crazy distances, often going through multiple countries, each with their own rules and regulations and legal systems.
right.
I mean, without some really clear understanding from the get-go about who is responsible for what, the potential for things going sideways is, huge.
Yeah, I can imagine.
Costly disputes, logistical nightmares. The material you sent highlights two fundamental aspects of this whole thing.
Okay.
First, you've got the different ways you can actually contract for the ocean voyage itself.
Right.
And then this other layer, this globally recognized framework called Incoterms is 2020.
Okay.
And that essentially sets the rules of the game for international sales.
Yeah, you actually flag some really interesting ways companies can pay for that ocean journey.
Mm-hmm.
Some options sound super basic, and others are like a full-service deal.
Yeah, exactly.
And then you're right. This Incoterms 2020 thing seems like the secret weapon to avoiding those, wait, who is supposed to pay for this?
Moments.
Yeah, for sure. It's like having a common language everyone agrees on. Right, exactly.
Now we're arguing about interpretations.
So let's try to break down these concepts in a way that makes sense so people can spot the red flags and really understand how these rules affect their bottom line and, who is carrying the risk at each step of the way.
I like that.
Aiming for that, aha moment, hopefully.
Absolutely. To really grasp the importance of this, imagine a situation where, let's say, some goods get damaged while they're being loaded onto a ship.
Okay.
Now, if everyone isn't crystal clear on who is responsible for what, well, you could be looking at a massive legal battle.
Oh, yeah.
Just trying to figure out who has to foot the bill.
Mm-hmm.
That's why these frameworks are so critical. They're designed to prevent these kinds of headaches.
Right. They lay down the law before anything can even go wrong.
Exactly.
Smart. All right. So let's get down to brass tacks. Let's start with actually getting your goods across the ocean.
Sounds good.
You shared some info on something called, okay, bear with me here, Formas de contratación del flete marítimo, which I think means different ways to contract for ocean freight, right?
Yeah, that's the gist of it.
Different flavors of ocean freight contracts.
Correct.
The most basic one seems to be something called Flete Básico. What is that? The bare minimum?
Flete Básico is, as the name implies, basic.
Uh-huh. Okay.
It covers transporting your cargo from one port to another. That's it.
So just basically paying for the space on the ship.
You got it.
Huh.
Think of it like buying a seat on a plane, but for your cargo.
Okay. And it doesn't include any of the work involved in getting the goods onto the ship in the first place?
Yeah.
Or off the ship at the other end?
Not at all.
Gotcha. So while Flete Básico might seem like the cheapest option at first glance, you really need to factor in all the extra costs you'll have at both ends.
Right.
It's like transportation, point A to point B, done.
That's Flete Básico in a nutshell.
Then we have something called liner terms. That sounds a little more, involved. What's usually included in that?
Yeah, liner terms typically include loading the goods onto the ship at the starting port, stowing them securely for the journey, then unstowing them when they get to the destination, and finally unloading them from the vessel.
Okay, so it takes care of all the heavy lifting at both ends.
Yeah, think of it as covering everything from when the ship's crane hooks onto the cargo at the origin to when the crane releases it at the destination.
Yeah.
Anything before or after that, you're usually on your own.
So it's like a more hands-on approach from the shipping company.
Exactly. They handle the loading, securing, and unloading.
Now, what about F.I.O.S? That sounds, I don't know, a bit intimidating.
It's not as scary as it sounds.
Okay, good. What does that stand for?
It stands for free in and out stows.
In and out stowed. Okay.
And the main thing to remember here is that free refers to the shipping line. They're basically saying we're not paying for those operations. So this type of contract actually excludes the costs of loading the goods, that's the free in, part unloading of them, the free out, and then all the stowing and unstowing inside the ship itself, that's the stowed.
So if you go with F.I.O.S, you're just paying for the sea voyage itself.
That's right.
And you're on the hook for all that handling at both ends.
Correct. You, as the shipper or the receiver, have to arrange and pay for all those activities.
So F.I.O.S could be a good option if, say, you've got really good deals with companies at the ports that can handle the loading and unloading, right?
That's a great point. It can be a strategic choice if you have those relationships in place.
But it definitely puts more of the logistics and costs on you.
Definitely. You're taking on more of the coordination outside of the actual sailing.
All right, and then the last one you mentioned was Flete All-In. That sounds like, well, the easiest option.
Yeah, it's kind of like the we'll take care of everything package.
So what's usually included in that?
Flete All-In aims to be comprehensive, including most, if not all, of the operational costs associated with the ocean shipment.
Oh, okay.
Sometimes it even extends to cover inland delivery to a warehouse at the final destination.
Oh, wow.
It's meant to give you one all-inclusive price.
But it sounds like it's really important to read the fine print.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Don't assume anything.
Yeah.
Make sure you know exactly what's covered and what's not before you sign on the dotted line.
All in can mean different things to different companies.
Exactly. Clarity is key.
All right, so those are the main ways you can pay for the ocean part of the journey.
Yeah, that covers the main types of contracts, yeah.
So now let's talk about Incoterms 2020. You said these are like standardized international trade terms. What makes them so universally accepted? Like, why does everyone use them?
Well, Incoterms are this globally recognized authoritative set of rules, and they were developed by the International Chamber of Commerce, or the ICC. So you can think of them as the common language everyone agrees to use when writing international sales contracts, especially when it comes to the actual delivery of goods.
Right.
They spell out all the obligations, costs, and risks associated with the transportation and delivery process for both the seller and the buyer.
Okay.
And because they're standardized, they're widely used. In fact, the sources you sent say over 80% of international trade relies on them.
Wow, that's a lot.
Yeah, it really cuts down on the potential for misunderstandings and legal disputes that can come up if people are interpreting things differently.
Right, everyone's on the same page. So these Incoterms get updated every so often, right?
Yes, about every 10 years.
Why is that?
Well, the ICC revises them to keep up with the ever-changing landscape of international trade.
Okay.
New technologies, best practices, things like that.
Gotcha.
The most recent version is Incoterms 2020.
Okay.
And it's super important to be specific about which version you're using in your contracts, because some of the rules can actually change from one edition to the next.
Okay, yeah.
So using an outdated version could lead to problems you didn't anticipate.
So it's not enough to just say like FOB. You need to say FOB, whatever the port is, Incoterms 2020.
Exactly. You got to be specific.
Crystal clear. That makes a lot of sense. So you grouped these Incoterms into 4 categories.
Right.
E, F, C, and D. Let's start with Group E, which is EXW or X works. So what's the seller responsible for in this case?
EXW is the most basic level of responsibility for the seller. They essentially just make the goods available to you, the buyer, at their own premises.
Okay.
Like their factory, warehouse, wherever they operate.
So it's like, here's the stuff, come and get it.
Basically.
Okay.
And from that moment on, you, the buyer, are pretty much in charge of everything else.
Everything.
You handle loading the goods, transporting them, insuring them, and all the export-import procedures.
Oh, wow.
So while that initial price tag might look really attractive, remember, you're taking on a lot of responsibility.
Yeah, and potentially a lot of costs.
Definitely. It's a trade-off.
So EXW is like you're buying something at the factory gate, you picked it up, now good luck getting it home.
That's a good analogy.
And home could be across the world. Okay, let's move on to Group F.
Sounds good.
This group includes FCA, F.A.S, and F.O.B. And these all involve the seller delivering the goods to a carrier that the buyer chooses, right?
That's right.
But they do it at different points in the process. So first up is FCA, which is free carrier.
Yeah, FCA is a really flexible Incoterm. The seller's responsibility ends when they deliver the goods to whichever carrier you, the buyer, have chosen at a specific agreed-upon location.
So that could be like the seller's own warehouse?
It could be.
or a transportation terminal,
Yeah,
or a freight forwarder's warehouse.
pretty much any place you both agree on.
Okay, so it's pretty adaptable.
Exactly.
But the important thing is, once those goods are with that carrier at that location, the risk of anything happening to them shifts to the buyer.
Right.
And the buyer then takes over responsibility for all the major transportation costs from that point on.
That's FCA in a nutshell.
So it's flexible, but you got to be ready to take on the responsibility. Then we have F.A.S, which is free alongside ship. This one's specifically for sea transport, right?
FAS is only for sea or inland waterway transport. And with FAS, the seller's done their part when the goods are placed right next to the ship that you, the buyer, have chosen at the port of shipment.
So the risk transfers to the buyer once the goods are literally alongside the vessel.
That's right.
Okay, and then the buyer is responsible for everything from that point on.
Correct. Loading the goods onto the ship, the main sea voyage, everything.
So the key difference between FCA and FAS is that very specific delivery point.
Exactly. SCA is flexible. FAS is all about being alongside the ship at the port.
Okay, gotcha. And finally, in Group F, we have FOB, which is free on board. This is a really common one, right?
Yeah, you hear it all the time.
So what exactly does it involve?
FOB, like FAS,
Mhm.
is only for sea or inland waterway transport. And in this case, the seller's responsibility is to get the goods loaded onto the ship that you, the buyer, have nominated, and it all happens at the named port of shipment.
Okay.
The risk transfers to you, the buyer, when the goods pass over the ship's rail.
Okay, so there's this symbolic moment of passing the ship's rail where the risk changes hands.
Exactly. Up to that point, it's the seller's responsibility.
Gotcha. So they pay for everything up to that point, including, like, clearing the goods for export.
That's right. They handle getting it ready to leave the country.
Okay, and then from the ship's rail onwards, it's all on the buyer.
Correct. You're in charge of the main carriage and all the costs from that moment on.
So to sum up, Group F FCA is flexible, FAS is alongside the ship, and FOB is on board the ship.
That's a great summary.
Okay, moving right along. Group C includes CFR, CIF, CPT, and CIP. And here, it seems like the seller pays for the main transport, but the risk transfers to the buyer a little earlier in the game.
Right. That's the key distinction with this group.
Okay, let's start with CFR, which is costs and freight.
With CFR, the seller covers the cost of transporting the goods to the port of destination that you've named.
Okay.
But, and this is important, the risk of anything happening to those goods and any additional costs that pop up after they've been loaded onto the ship, that all shifts from the seller to you, the buyer, when the goods cross the ship's rail at the port of shipment.
Okay, so it's kind of like the seller pays for the ticket to get the goods to the destination, but once they're on board, you're on your own if anything goes wrong.
That's a good way to think about it. The seller covers the main transport, but you bear the risk during the voyage.
All right, then there's CIF, which is cost, insurance, and freight. So how does adding insurance into the mix change things?
CIF is very similar to CFR, but with one big difference. The seller also has to buy marine insurance to cover the risk of loss or damage during the voyage to that port of destination you've specified.
So the seller pays for the insurance premium.
Exactly. They handle that part.
Okay.
But, just like with CFR, the risk itself still passes to you when the goods go over the ship's rail at the port of shipment.
So CIF is like CFR, but with the safety net provided by the seller.
Yeah, they're taking on the responsibility of getting the insurance, but you're still bearing the risk.
Okay. And now we come to CPT, which is carriage paid too.
This one's a bit different because CPT works for any mode of transport, not just sea.
Okay, that's important to know.
Yeah, it could be truck, train, ship, or any combination. So the seller pays to get the goods to that named place of destination, wherever that may be.
Okay.
But here's the key difference from CFR and CIF. The risk of loss or damage switches from the seller to you when the goods are handed over to the very first carrier.
Oh, I see. So that could be much earlier in the journey than with the C-only Incoterms.
Exactly. If the first leg is by truck, for example, the risk transfers as soon as those goods are loaded onto the truck.
So that's a really important distinction for goods that are traveling by, say, truck and then ship or some other combination.
Right. You have to know when that risk shifts to you.
Okay, and then the last one in Group C is CIP, carriage and insurance paid too.
CIP is to CPT what CIF is to CFR. Basically, the seller handles the carriage, but they also have to get insurance.
But the risk transfer point is the same as with CPT, right?
Yes, it still switches to you when the goods are handed to that first carrier.
Okay, so it's all about the seller taking care of the main transport and the insurance, but the buyer assumes the risk pretty early on in the process.
Exactly. That's the defining characteristic of Group C.
So now we're on to the final group, Group D, which includes DAP, DPU, and DDP. And this group seems to put the most responsibility on the seller, right?
Yeah, they're handling things almost all the way to the very end.
Okay, let's unpack them one by one. First up is DAP, delivered at place.
With DAP, the seller takes care of all the costs and all the risks involved in getting the goods to a specific place that you've named.
So that could be like my warehouse,
It could be.
or my factory,
Yeah.
or really any other agreed location, but it has to be in my country, right?
That's right. The named place has to be in the buyer's country.
And the goods are considered delivered when they're made available to me at that location, ready for unloading.
Exactly. That's when the seller's responsibility ends.
Okay, so they handle everything up to that point, and then I have to take care of the actual unloading and any import duties or taxes.
Right. Those final steps are your responsibility.
So the seller gets it there, ready to go, and then it's my turn to take over.
That's DAP in a nutshell.
Okay, then we have DPU, delivered at place unloaded, which sounds like it goes one step further than DAP.
You got it. DPU is unique because it's the only Incoterm where the seller is specifically responsible for unloading the goods at the named place.
Oh, interesting.
So they don't just get it there. They actually get it off the truck or out of the container, whatever it may be.
Okay.
And then, once the goods are unloaded and ready for you, your responsibility kicks in, usually dealing with those import duties and taxes.
Gotcha. So DPU is like DAP plus the unloading.
Yeah.
They handle that extra step.
Exactly. It can be a big help for the buyer.
And then finally, we have DDP, delivered duty paid.
This is where the seller really does the most, right?
Right. With DDP, the seller has maximum responsibility. They handle all the costs, all the risks of getting the goods to that named place. And on top of that, they also take care of all the import clearance, pay any import duties and taxes, and deliver the goods to you, ready to be unloaded.
Wow. They handle pretty much everything.
Yeah, it's designed to be as hassle-free for the buyer as possible.
So as the buyer, all I have to do is open the door and accept the goods.
Pretty much. You're essentially just receiving the goods at that point.
That sounds amazing, but I bet it's not cheap. You're right. The seller is going to factor all those extra services and responsibilities into their price.
Okay, so DDP is like the premium option where the seller takes care of almost everything.
It's the most comprehensive Incoterm for the buyer.
All right, we've covered all the different types of ocean freight contracts and this whole world of Incoterms 2020. But how do these two things actually work together in real life? Like when you're actually shipping goods across borders?
Good question. Think of it this way. An Incoterm, like FOB or CIF, tells you who is responsible for paying for the main transportation, the freight.
Okay.
But then the specific type of freight contract they choose, whether it's F.I.O.S, liner terms, or Flete All-In, that tells you exactly what's included in that freight cost that the responsible party is paying.
So the Incoterm decides who pays for the ride, and the freight contract tells you what amenities come with the ride.
That's a great way to put it. They work together to paint the full picture.
Okay, that makes sense. They're two sides of the same coin. Can you give me like a real-world example to show how these two things connect?
Let's go back to that example you gave earlier about an Argentinian exporter selling goods on CIF Rotterdam terms.
Okay.
So the CIF Incoterm means the seller has to arrange and pay for the transportation to the port of Rotterdam and get insurance for the goods during that main part of the journey.
Right.
But the risk of something happening to the goods passes to you, the buyer, as soon as they're loaded onto the ship in Argentina.
Okay, so the seller gets it to Rotterdam and insures it, but if something happens on the way, it's my problem.
Correct. Now, let's say the shipping agreement the Argentinian exporter has with the shipping line is also F.I.O.S, free in and out stowed.
Okay.
So even though they've fulfilled their CIF responsibility by paying for the transport to Rotterdam, that F.I.O.S contract says they don't have to pay for unloading the goods once they get there.
Right.
So even though the seller paid to get it to Rotterdam, you, as the buyer, would have to pay for unloading it because that wasn't included in the F.I.O.S agreement.
I see. So you could think you're covered because the seller is using CIF, but then get hit with unexpected costs at the destination because of the F.I.O.S contract.
Exactly. That's why it's so important to look at both the Incoterm and the freight contract details.
Got it. You can't assume anything. You got to check both.
Clarity is key.
So based on everything we've talked about, what are some key takeaways for our listeners who are dealing with international trade?
If you're an exporter, Think about using Incoterms like CIP or DDP.
Okay.
They mean you're taking on more responsibility and costs up front, but they can make things a lot easier for your customer, which can be a big plus for building relationships.
Right. It's like offering a more premium service.
Exactly. It shows you're willing to go the extra mile. But be sure to factor those costs into your prices.
Makes sense. And what if you're the one importing goods?
If you're the importer, Incoterms like SCA or EXW can sometimes get you a lower initial price, and they reduce your immediate responsibilities. But that means you need to have your own logistics network in place to handle everything from the point of origin onwards.
So you need to be ready to take on that logistical burden.
Exactly. If you have those systems in place, it can be a really good strategy. But if you're new to this or don't have the resources, it could cause some headaches.
All right, so it's a trade-off. What are some of the non-negotiables, the things you absolutely have to check when you're looking at these international trade agreements?
First and foremost, always specify which version of Incoterms you're using.
Okay, write out Incoterms 2020 in the contract.
Exactly. Don't leave any room for doubt. The rules can change between versions, and being vague here can lead to disputes down the road.
Got it. Specificity is key. What else?
Pay close attention to the mode of transport.
Okay.
Some Incoterms, like CPT and CIP, are designed for any mode of transport, but others, like FOB, FAS, and CFR, are only for sea or inland waterway transport.
So using the wrong Incoterm for how you're shipping the goods can create confusion about who's responsible for what.
Exactly. It's crucial to align the Incoterm with the actual shipping method.
And the last crucial check.
Be super precise when naming the place in the Incoterm. Instead of just saying Rotterdam, say Rotterdam terminal name or something equally specific.
So instead of just the city, you want the exact location.
Right. It adds another level of clarity about where the goods are being delivered and where the risk officially transfers.
Okay, that's super helpful. So to recap, we've covered the different types of ocean freight contracts, from the bare bones to the all-inclusive, and we've explored the world of Incoterms 2020, which define who pays for what and when the risk shifts from the seller to the buyer. Hopefully, you're walking away from this with a much clearer understanding of how these two things work together to govern the flow of goods across borders.
And to highlight why this matters for you, understanding these concepts can save you a lot of headaches.
Yeah, real-world stuff.
It can prevent unexpected costs, reduce the risk of legal battles, and make your international trade operations run a lot smoother.
So, as you're thinking about all of this, and maybe looking back at the material you sent us, here's a final thought to chew on.
Okay.
What's one thing about either Incoterms or freight contracts that really makes you think differently about how these international trade agreements are put together?
Interesting question.
And maybe think about a past or future shipping scenario you've been in or might be in.
Yeah.
Knowing what you know now, is there anything you would do differently?
I like that. It's about taking this knowledge and applying it to real-world situations.
Exactly. That's what this deep dive is all about.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks for being here.